I knew this story. I heard this story about 10 years ago, and like you, because we were just discussing this just now, I just knew it as a sort of one-line anecdote that Mackintosh had spent some time living in Walberswick just when the First World War broke out, and that because he was such an eccentric and unlikely character that stayed on after the summer visitors left, people became suspicious of him, and they were concerned that maybe rather than a Scottish artist, he was actually a German spy. And I remember thinking, someone actually told me this after I'd written The Sea House, which is another book set in a fictionalised Walberswick. And people do quite often present writers with an idea for a story, and you always think, oh, wouldn't that be fantastic? But I've learned that it's almost never helpful. Because in a way, the better the story is, the least able you feel to make it your own. And so this time I remember having the same feeling, like that is a really good story, but it's not my story. It's sort of not something I could imagine getting hold of. And I remember thinking, I know nothing about Mackintosh, I know very little about the First World War, and I sort of put it away. But many years later, I decided that I would write a novel set in the house that I was living in at the time, and Mackintosh sort of crept in. And then I started thinking again about what an interesting story it was, and doing a bit of research. And the more research I did on Mackintosh and this tiny anecdote, the more fascinated and moved I became by what I discovered.
Oh, and wasn't the house truly linked to Mackintosh as well?
Yes, I think for me anyway, people often sort of describe my writing as quite autobiographical, and I think most people's writing is, but I don't really take any trouble to disguise my links, but I like to feel that there's a personal element to get to a story. And this was the personal element that was almost like a gift. So in about 2000, I think, we bought a cottage in the village, and the man who sold it to us had done a kind of a short history of the house. It turned out the house used to be the village inn, used to be the Anchor pub, and it had been moved when the Anchor was rebuilt behind it as a larger pub that's there now. And the little old cottage that used to be the inn had been taken down, and rather than being demolished, it had been moved by wheelbarrow and rebuilt in someone else's large garden as a residential house, which over the years had gone from one owner to the next, and now was ours. So this was part of his history, but he'd gone through the census, and he'd found out little details about all the different publicans who'd run the Anchor Inn going back to 1735. And so I was really struck by this, partly because it was such a list of tragic stories, Mr. William Easy, who had a sale of his effects out on the street, and Mr. Cady, whose mother drowned herself in the water butt, and then who fell down a well on his way home from Wickham Market. It sort of went on and on. And I remember thinking, I'm so glad that this building's been moved, because that was obviously not a very lucky spot. And it was a very interesting house. For some reason, the last three owners of the house, they'd been sort of linked in different ways to my family. The first, one of them had been a friend of my grandparents who'd come to Suffolk in the 30s, when they'd arrived in this country as sort of emigre refugees from Germany. And this cousin of my friend of my grandparents, who had originally been a Viennese psychotherapist, he had left it to another relative, etc., etc. It had gone on like that. But for some reason, all of these people, when they'd left the house, had left everything in it that they'd ever owned, and everything was labelled. And so when I got it, the people said, I hope you don't mind, but we're going to leave everything in it. I remember thinking, you found the perfect person. I'd like nothing better than rifling around in sort of second-hand stores and other people's things. So it was a dream come true in a way, although everything was very old, very rusty and very damp. Even sort of old tins of food that would have been, as our builder said, suffering from damp. Everything was, but everything was labelled. And I thought, when I started writing the book, that I'd be able to weave in the strangeness of it was going to be set sort of now. There was going to be a woman who rents a house, everything's labelled, she sort of tries to work out the significance of this. And also, I was going to use the fact that there was also, I say this, I try and make it as gentle as possible, but there was a ghost in the house, a very benign and friendly, but quite territorial young boy who just hovered in the back hall. And so I thought, that could all surely be enough for a novel. But as I started to write, the idea that Mackintosh had stayed, this was in the history, that he'd stayed in the pub, and I kept sort of coming into my head so much, thinking about this house and its history, and the idea that Charles Rennie Mackintosh had taken a room there. And I thought, surely I can weave him into the story. But it took me a long time to realise that actually that was the story, and I got rid of the woman, the labels, the ghost, and I sort of started again just before the First World War, and I took my ghost and made him into a real boy. And his name is Thomas Maggs. One of the publicans of the Anchor was a family called Maggs, who had many children, and many of them, as so often was in the history, 10 children, 2 surviving, often it's said in the census. And so Thomas is a boy who had 6 brothers who all died, and he's the only surviving boy, very precious to his family, but he has 2 older sisters. And I sort of wove his story into the centre of the book, and he sits in that pub in 1914 when Mackintosh first comes in. Luckily, I discovered Mackintosh was a real drinker, so the place he'd find pretty damn fast was going to be the Anchor Inn.
And Thomas himself, he has another thing that links him to Mackintosh. I didn't know about Mackintosh. They both limped, didn't they?
Yes, I didn't know that either. What I read in the census was that this one family, I don't think it necessarily was the Maggs family, I put so many things together I can't remember now, but one family who'd had many children who all died in infancy had one lame son who'd lived till the age of 97 and had become an incredibly important person and a town clerk and a bigwig in Southwold. And I liked the idea that this frail child had sort of actually been a very strong person. And so I gave him a limp, and that became a huge part of his character. And as I was researching Mackintosh, just in a small, there's not an awful lot about his personal life. It's a lot about his drawings and his architectural practice, his vision. And I saw, to my surprise, that someone said that Mackintosh had visited them, and that there had been a fire, that actually one of the Christmas tree candles had caught hold of his cape, and that he'd staggered backwards because he had a club foot and fallen. And I thought, oh my God, Mackintosh limps as well. My characters have so much in common. I can't believe it. And I'd forgotten I'd actually made one of them up. But anyway, this really does bond them. And they are both outsiders in a way because of this. I think when you have a disability and you're slightly set apart, that anyway, they are sort of made for each other in terms of connecting.
And Thomas is an artist as well, isn't he? That's another connection.
Well, he likes to draw boats. What Thomas really wants to do with his life is to go to sea, and he lives in this fishing community. But what he is what his parents want for him, because they don't think he's strong enough to ever be a fisherman, is to be an educated person. So they send him to a school inland, and they turn him away to face inland. So in order to sort of assuage his desire for the sea, he goes and sits on the river and goes to the sailors' reading room in Southwold and draws all the boats. Whether he really is an artist, I don't know if he is much of one, but he certainly starts to learn to see the world in a different way from looking at the way Mackintosh draws.
You mentioned research, and you've obviously done so much research about Mackintosh, also about Suffolk, because the book really does have a flavour of Suffolk. I'm sure you'll agree if you've read the book as well. And also about this period in the First World War.
I always think that I hate doing research. What I really want to do is sit in my study and just make things up and to close my eyes and just for the story to come alive. But actually, doing research is fantastic once I've jumped, past my idea of what I think writing should be for me. And the research about Suffolk was a real pleasure, because I mostly read memoirs and novels and just got a real feeling. I found a wonderful book as well. It had been published in 1911. I think just self-published. I'm not sure if you can get it anywhere apart from someone gave it to me in the village. And it was a woman called Carol Christie who moved to Walberswick, and she felt really concerned that it was changing too much and too fast. And so she interviewed lots of the old people in the village, and she wrote lots of things about what life was like now in 1911. And there was an old lady who said, oh, it's changed so much. If it wasn't for still being able to understand people, you'd think we were in France. There's lots of, and then lovely memories, I suppose because people are always thinking everything's changed too much. And there was another quote from someone who said, yes, when I was a girl, the summers lasted 6 months. Now, if it wasn't for the leaves on the trees, you'd never even know it was summer. And there's lots of things, and there's things about ghosts and things about the village shop. So I got lovely details from that. And then you mentioned the New Angles Prize, which I'm delighted that I'm shortlisted for this year, but about 2 years ago, when I was writing this book, I was a judge. So for a few months, all my reading was books set or inspired by Suffolk. So that kind of reading Ronald Blythe and reading all these lovely novels, and reading, actually the winner that year was Jules Pretty, who wrote a wonderful book about walking the coast of East Anglia. All these things sort of fed into my imagination. So that research was a joy. Finding out about the First World War and how it affected Suffolk was actually really fascinating. I had no idea that it was considered to be the most dangerous place in Britain, because it was so close across the water to the battlefields of Flanders, and you could hear the guns apparently if you stood on the beach. So that gave me a real feeling of the sort of danger of the village experience. And it also made absolute sense that what had happened to Mackintosh was that he arrived in the early summer, as so many visitors always did, and it's been a holiday village for hundreds and hundreds of years. But then, almost as soon as the war was declared, people felt that they were in a really dangerous place and they must get away as fast as they could. But Mackintosh and his wife, they didn't really feel they had anywhere to go. They'd left Glasgow at a very low state of Mackintosh's career. Even though we think of him as being such a renowned figure and so famous and successful, he, for the last few years, before 1914, had been unemployed and impoverished and mentally anguished, and the money that they were living on was getting lower and lower. And their great friend, Francis Newbury, who ran the Glasgow School of Art, had said, why don't you go and stay in my house in Walberswick? That will give you a break. And so they'd only been there a few weeks. They didn't want to go back to Glasgow. And so they stayed, and they stayed and they stayed. And because all the other visitors had gone, and even local people who could possibly afford to had gone, the village was getting a small and much more closed-in place. And when places are small and closed in, they often look to see who's in their midst who might be a threat to them. And so they turned their gaze on this eccentric-looking man who didn't necessarily abide by the laws that had been introduced. Blackout blinds must be pulled down, no one must even light a cigarette after dark in case it was a signal to the enemy. All the sort of fear and paranoia, and people need to turn it against someone.
In the book he has some German letters, doesn't he?
Yes.
And writing. Is that based on truth as well?
Yes, because when he arrived in Walberswick, frustrated that he could no longer design anything, his career was at such a low ebb, he had a wonderful friendship with a German art critic called Mathusius, who had suggested that he keep on drawing local wild flowers, which he'd already been doing somewhere else, and he could put them into a collection. And one of the really wonderful things that I did know, but I was able to weave into the book, is that while he was in Walberswick, he did a series of very beautiful architectural flower pictures. And so he was writing back and forth to Germany, sending them, discussing them. In fact, we used one of them. Leslie has it on the hardback. The paperback just come out, but on the hardback, this is a fritillaria, and there's a little box in the original print which says, MMM, CRM, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and on the other side, rather romantically, the initials of his wife, who was an artist too, MMM, Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh. And then it says Walmerswick, 1914. And yes, there were so many things to weave in. I was spoiled for choice. Having just been talking about the outbreak of the First World War, Thomas, I was going to read a bit, and I was going to read a bit from this section. So maybe this is a good time to just give you a few pages for people who haven't read the book. I usually read a bit from when Mackintosh first comes into the pub and they meet. But I've read that quite a lot, and I thought I'd try a different bit today. Because I always feel that people want to hear more about Mackintosh, but as we're in Suffolk, I thought people might want to hear more about Suffolk.
Are you going to attempt a Suffolk accent?
I'm really not going to. That may actually be the hardest accent ever.
You can ask questions. I mean, if you've got a burning question, feel free to shout at us now, but we will leave time at the end if you've got questions.
One of Thomas has two sisters, Mary and Anne, and Mary works up at the big house. And I think that's probably the father. His father, as so many of the publicans of the Anchor is a drinker, not a very pleasant way. It's Mary who hears it first, borrows a bicycle from the gardener up at the big house, and races here so fast her cheeks are red and her hair hangs loose out of her cap. But she still has her white apron on, and her boots are gleaming with the polishing she gives them last thing at night. It's the war, she says, as she flies in. There's talk of nothing else at Blyfield House. Someone's been shot, not just the King of Greece, an Archduke of somewhere. She's panting, fit to burst. It'll come to me, but that's who started it. And now Germany's declared war, and the master says there's no avoiding it. He sent his two oldest boys to Southwold to offer their services in the town hall. He says he'll be proud if they're the first to be called up. It is a Saturday, and there are 3 men in the bar. Old Tilson and his brother Fred, and Mac, who'd come in an hour before, and is drinking one drink slowly, in that way I know, which means it has to last. The Tilson men look up. You don't say? Their mouths are open. They lost a cousin in the Boer War, and before news could travel back, his wife had named their child Pretoria May, because the phrase was always on her lips, Pretoria may win. We'll best be off, the brothers say, and as they push open the door, we hear the church bells ringing loud and urgent, enough for anyone at all to stop and wonder at them. Father pours himself a glass of scotch, and when Mac looks up, he pours him one too. Good Lord, Mother is by the open door. They're not wasting any time. And I go and stand beside her, and there, coming up the street, is a wagon loaded up with luggage, and on the box beside the driver, in a hat garlanded with flowers, sits Mrs. Tilbury, who spends her summers at the Low House by the ferry. 3 of her children sit behind, with their nursemaid and a wiry white dog called Madam, and they wave at us cheerily as they pass by. Where are they going, I ask. The mother crosses her arms and shrugs. Away from the coast, Father joins us, the smell of whiskey hot on him, where they think it's safer. Mac drains his glass. I'll be away then too. Pulling his cape about him, he steps out into the street. Wait, I call. When I see Wait, I call, when I see he's turned towards the sea. I'm coming with you. And although Mother clutches at my shoulder, I slip out of the door. I've never walked with Mac before, only followed him, and I wince as our 2 crippled feet snag on the same uneven ground. We pass the bell, empty of its men, and climb down into the scrub of land below the dunes. What will we see, I wonder, as we climb through slipping sand, and as we come up over the ridge of the beach, I expect to find warships already massing out to sea. But there's nothing there, just a Bell steamer gliding towards Southwold, and Danky in his corded cap and wading boots, throwing out a line. Mac walks down to the edge of the water and stares out to the horizon. We were thinking of travelling on from here, he says quietly, to Paris and Vienna, but now he shields his eyes. I'm not so sure. We walk on, following the line of the beach until it curves, treading in single file over the hard sand below the shingle, and then, as if it had been agreed, we climb the wall of stones and cross the top and skelter down the other side towards the wooden bridge that crosses the flat river. 2 swans live on this river, their reflections stretching white and deep, and here they are today, leading their young brown family in single file. Mac stops when we come to the top of the marsh and snaps off a twig of hawthorn. He examines its crinkled leaves and the swivel of its thorns and slides it into the pocket of his cape. He stops again when we reach Hoist Wood. There are old trees here, ghost trees I think of them. So long have their trunks been stranded from the sun, but their tops are green where they stretch them, and some leaves grow in shafts of light. If you're still here in spring, I tell him, I'll bring you to this wood at daybreak. That's when you hear the nightingale, at dusk too if you're lucky. I'd like that, he is gruff. But we both know he won't still be here by spring. The summer visitors pack up every year at the first curled leaf of autumn, and they don't come back until the following July. As Mac and I cut back across the common, stopping now and then while he examines a flower, we see a stream of people moving along the path that runs down from the church. They have trunks and bundles piled onto prams, small children running alongside, and one old lady in a black bonnet sitting on a cart. As we join them, I see the 2 Miss Bishops, who've rented our big room each August ever since I was small, hurrying along. Father is behind, red in the face and sweating, carrying their bags. Where are you going? I ask them, quiet, so as not to rile Father, who looks ready to spit blood. And they look at me, eyes wide with fear. Home, they say, to Wanstead. We have to get to safety. And they explain how they owe it to themselves and their one remaining family member, a niece who is not entirely well. As they are talking, we hear the train roar over the bridge, and all along the path people pick up speed. Give us a hand, boy, Father says, his shoulder sagging, and so I take one of the bags from him and let him fall behind, while I hurry on with the Miss Bishops to the station. Thank you, the older of the sisters says. I'd give you something for your trouble, but we need every last penny for our fare. Honestly, the other shakes her head, declaring war on a Saturday when the backs are closed. We had to borrow money from Mrs. Lasher at the shop. Poor woman, and we weren't the only ones asking for a loan. She dips into her pocket then and brings out a packet of peppermints, and dipping her fingers into the bag, she presents me with a round chipped sweet. I slip it into my mouth. Thank you. And I'm surprised to find how much I mind seeing their tweed-skirted figures climbing onto the train. We hope to be back next summer, one tells me when Father has lumbered up with the last bag. Indeed, the other one agrees, and she takes hold of my hand. Thomas, she whispers, I left a little sketch drying on the window ledge of our room. Keep it for me, will you? It's just a sad old thing of geese on the green, nothing much, but I'd be glad to look at it again. I nod. I know their ways, how they cluck and sigh over their efforts, cheering each other on when each piece is done. The younger Miss Bishop likes to paint animals, rabbits and horses, and more often than not our hens, while her sister is only interested in the sea. Whatever the weather, she sets up her easel in the dunes and catches the waves, using up her palette of colours on their browns and greens and blues. The train hoots, doors slam, and with a wrench it steams out of the station, packed to bursting, faces pressed against the windows, regretful, excited, glad to have their holidays broken into, if it means they are included in the goings-on of the world. I stand and wait till the train is out of sight, until I can no longer hear the clack of its wheels as it steams on its way to Blytheborough. I turn, but Father has slunk away, so I walk back across the common, past the place where Mac has last seen inspecting a wall of gorse. He'll be gone soon too. Even now, Mrs. Mac will most likely be packing up their things, and I think how I've never had a chance to ask him if he's seen the Millside ghost. I want to tell him how I saw it, Mother and I, although Mother will never admit to such a thing. And I promise myself that if I meet Mac again, I'll tell him how we were walking to the top of the village just as the light was turning grey, going to visit Mrs. Horrid, whose husband had been taken ill, when I looked left into the mill yard, and there she was, looming out of the shadows, half as tall as a barn. Mother reached for my hand and began to run. I turned my head for another glimpse. But Mother was rushing me along too fast, and she didn't pause or slow her step until we were outside Mrs. Horrod's door. "Why did you pull me along so?" I asked. I could hardly get my breath, and she rapped hard on the wood and said she didn't like to keep nobody waiting. Or was it because you saw that lady in the yard? And she scowled at me and tightened her grip so that my fingers squashed and mashed up inside hers.
Thank you so much for reading that. And as you talk about, walking across the heath and through the sand, I really get the feeling you've done all of that as well, obviously, as living in Walkersville.
I think it's one of the real pleasures of writing a book in a place that you know very well and also love so much, because it's sort of almost like you're kind of cementing it for yourself. I felt this with the Sea House. I thought so much about Suffolk and this village that I loved, and then getting it down, but I was using an outsider in that novel. So in a way, like me, she was sort of seeing things for the first time, or sort of marvelling at things. Whereas what was lovely about having Thomas as a narrator was that he doesn't make such a big deal of it. So he's feeling the sand, and he's watching the sea, and he knows the colours and the browns and greens of it, but he's not sort of trying to impress us with it. It's just what he knows. And so it was very different, but just as pleasurable.
Well, one of the big themes in the book is the letters that Mackintosh is writing to his wife, who's gone back to Glasgow, hasn't she?
Yes.
And they steam the letters open and read them. I mean, is this based on real letters?
Yes, I found a wonderful book of letters. After Mackintosh, after the war, Mackintosh and his wife, they were so impoverished that they found that one of the ways that they could exist more successfully was to live in France, and they could live on just a tiny amount of money every week by living in a pension on the sort of Spanish-French border by the sea. And Mackintosh carried on painting, and at one point Margaret, his beloved wife, went back to England for she had some kind of trouble with her heart, and she had to go for quite a long trip to see doctors. And he wrote her what he calls a chronicle, because he writes to her every day, and she keeps all his letters. Maddeningly, her letters were not kept, but his letters are collected into a book, and they were owned by this wonderful family called the Davidsons, who really helped in protecting Mackintosh's legacy. But eventually the Hunterian Gallery Museum published them as a book. And so I read them all, and I used a little bit in each of my letters to Margaret from Mackintosh to just give the flavour of his character. And also because he says such romantic things to her, and it sort of gave me a real feeling for how really close they were. And so then, yes, to try and show us the letters, because of course what I'm trying to do with this book is give you a small biography of Mackintosh within a novel narrated by a young Suffolk boy. So everything that we read, that you will read, has to be filtered through Thomas. So of course, to see these letters, Thomas has to steam them open, and he has a reason for steaming them open, which I won't go into now, but it's about finding a way of telling all of Mackintosh's stories in an authentic way, so you don't think, why is he telling Thomas this? That was one of my real big challenges.
And you managed to weave in so much Suffolk. I mean, we've already talked about it. I read somewhere that you learnt to dab for eels. Is that true? And how to skin a rabbit.
Oh, I love that. I didn't know you read that. No, I didn't go so method in my... I just read about those things. For me, reading is almost like living. But no, the thought of pulling an eel up, and I read this wonderful description of, I think I read this, or did I make it up? It's so hard after a while to know. It's so confusing. But the idea in the book, anyway, Thomas gets an eel and he holds it, and it kind of thrashes around, and he manages to keep hold of it until it's still. I was researching a book, and I went in the course of my research, not this book, but my grandparents, who sort of came to Walkersville, so that was the beginning of my family association with it, had had a house before then on a little island in the east of Germany called Hiddensee. And I went there. It took me about 12 hours from London to find myself on this island. And my father said, never wanting ever himself to go anywhere apart from London, he was interested that I was going back to this place he'd spent the first 10 summers of his life in. And he said, I had a next door neighbour, a man called Karl Cottbus, I think. He said, maybe he's still there. He was a fisherman, his family were fishermen. So I asked, there was a tourist centre, which was the size of this table, and I said to the one man there, do you know this Karl Cottbus? And he said, yes. Oh, hang on. Yes, he's just over there. It was a very small island, fishing for eels. So anyway, we were introduced, and he said, come back in 2 hours and I'll make you some supper and we'll talk. And he cooked me eels. They were so disgusting. I was just, out of politeness, I managed to gulp a few pieces of sort of bony, oily, and so I feel as if I'd asked for eels. As you can tell, I was there. So I put eels into this book again.
It's brilliant how all your experiences that you've ever had can sort of weave into a book.
Yeah, you can use everything. In fact, as I was reading, I'd forgotten that one of the labelled things in the house was a small, rather sketchy picture of geese on the green. I hadn't realised I'd given it to the Miss Bishops. They painted that picture. So it's all useful.
And you mentioned Lucian, and of course he was an artist. Does that help you write about the art side of things in the book?
I think without even realising it, that was one of the things that I didn't have to research. I'm so grateful for things that you know. So when Thomas watches Mackintosh painting these pictures of flowers, I was able, as Thomas, to watch him, to see how slowly and painstakingly he worked, how he scrubbed it out. I did read up about his method, but he would use this thick white paper, and then he would get frustrated, and he would sometimes use a toothbrush to scrub it out so everything was gone, and then he'd start again. And when you look at the prints, you'd never know. You'd assume that just absolutely, with great ease, he'd done these beautiful, beautiful images. But I certainly spent my childhood watching my father, and it's hard for me to say I wouldn't know how much he'd scrubbed out, because I do see it, because I saw him do it. But sometimes, especially when I was very young, it seemed to take so long, because time was going so slowly. So when between 8 and 10, that he was still working on Wasteground and Paddington. I think, oh my God, the poor man. I just felt so bad for him still. And then sometimes I would see it, and it was actually there was less progress. And I couldn't imagine why he would scrub something out that looked pretty damn good to me. So I understood all of that for nothing, and I gave that to Thomas.
Yeah, because Mackintosh also isn't always a happy man, is he? And I wondered if that helps you sort of understand the angst of creativity in a way.
Yes. I never thought about those things, but I suppose so many artists are tortured and frustrated on some level by just trying to make something almost impossible. I mean, I've sat at my desk sometimes and thought, it's like trying to bend a piece of metal into the shape of a story. What am I doing? Why am I doing this to myself? Surely there are other things I could be doing with my life. But it is addictive. And Mackintosh was frustrated and tormented, but I have to say, for quite good reason. I'll just tell you a little bit about his life that I discovered, which was so surprising and unexpected for me to discover. One of the things actually that made me realise that this was a big story was one of the many things in the house was a shoebox with some clippings of things that related to the house. And one of them was a newspaper article from the late 90s saying that there had been an auction of Mackintosh's work, and some of his furniture had been sold for a chair had been sold for £35,000, etc. And it said that he had died in 1928, and his entire estate had been valued at £68. And that him and his wife had, lived in such poverty, and now both him and his wife's work was valuable and sold for huge amounts at auction. So I was kind of interested in that. But how did that happen? And what I discovered was that he'd had an extraordinary beginning to his career. He was only 27 when a competition was announced for somebody to design a school of art for Glasgow. And there had never been an actual school of art in Glasgow that was a purpose-built building. They had just hired rooms somewhere. And so Mackintosh, who had wanted to be an artist, but like so many artists around that time, and so many artists even now probably, his family had maneuvered him into being an architect's assistant, because at least it was a job that maybe he could actually earn a living at. And so he had worked he was working as a junior in a big firm called Honeyman and Keppie, a firm, not a big firm, and he drew a design for the Glasgow School of Art, and he presented it to Francis Newbery, who he was already friends with, because he went out and studied at the Glasgow School of Art on day release from the architects practice, and also sometimes at night school. So Newbery had already noticed that he was an extremely talented student. His design was chosen. And so that was a huge coup, age 27, 28, that he had won this competition. But because he was such a junior partner in the firm, probably not even a partner, he was an assistant, the partners, Honeyman and Keppie, they took it on as their job to create this building. And so they put the building up. Mackintosh was there every day, so, trying to get his vision, making sure that every last detail was put in place. But when the building was finished, and it was built in 2 stages, so it was built over 3 years, and when the first stage was built, they didn't have enough money to build the whole 2 wings. They just built the east wing, I think, and they opened it, and there was a big ceremony. The mayor came, all the grandees, the governors, the people who put the money in, Honeyman and Keppie, speeches, door opening, but never once was Mackintosh's name mentioned. And it took them 7 years to raise the rest of the money to build the second phase, in which time Mackintosh married this wonderful artist, Margaret MacDonald. They started creating a lot of things together, worked on his interiors. He said a beautiful thing about her, she has a genius where I have only talent. And she is half, if not 3/4, in all my designs. And they went to Vienna together, where in Europe they were really lauded and admired as innovative artists. And but in Britain, as is often the way, not so much. And 7 years later, the second phase was built, by which time Mackintosh, he wrote, I have this in the book, he wrote to a friend, my great desire is to have my name on my own work. And so when finally the second phase was finished, he insisted that that would be the case, and it was the case, although somebody wrote in the Glasgow paper, whoever designed this ugly building, it looks like a house of correction, he should be taken out into the street and have his bare ass whipped. So having his name on the building wasn't necessarily such a good thing for Mackintosh. And he finally left Honeyman and Keppie, and he set out on his own. This is around 1911. And he put out his script, architect for hire, and nobody wanted his services. He had a reputation by then as being extremely difficult to work with, a perfectionist, a visionary, somebody who, when he built them a house, if he came in and saw that they had yellow flowers on the table and not deep purple flowers, there would be trouble. And it's true, who would want their house designed by someone that prescriptive? And he was also a drinker. And there was something I read that said his lunchtimes stretched long into the afternoon. And so many reasons why his career was faltering. And luckily for him, he had this incredibly supportive wife whose career rather tragically also faltered, as his did, because they worked so closely together. And then that's when they came to Suffolk. And one of the many laws that was set out to protect the nation during the First World War, and all sorts of laws that came in, one of them was that no new buildings should be built. So, Mackintosh already at a low ebb, the idea that was, he didn't know, no one knew at that point the war was going to last for 4.5 years, but no new buildings. And in fact, Mackintosh never did go back to Glasgow, and he never did design anything, build anything again. Just a few alterations on houses. There's a sort of bedroom suite in a house in Derngate, a few places, but not that he wanted to design Liverpool Cathedral. He had such vision. So it was a very hard and frustrating career that he had. although he took great pleasure in the paintings that he did, and he was happy, I feel, in France. Maybe it was a relief to give up these complicated negotiations over buildings and just focus on being an artist, which was his first love. So I have this idea that he was very happy towards the end of his life, living in France with his mother, painting all day, living very cheaply, not really enough money to buy much alcohol, which was probably good, just some good red wine every day. And so many things I could say, but I see it's time is flying by. Maybe it's time to ask some questions.
Yeah, and the thing about Macintosh, I hadn't realised any of this, and I don't know about you as well if you've read the book, and yet you were still dealing with the book when the big fire happened at the arts college, wasn't it, as well? And so I guess you felt almost personally affronted for that?
I just felt, I was just reading through the last, with your publisher they give you sometimes just a 1 or 2 day extension, you say, I just want to read through it one more time, just to check. And I was doing that, reading the manuscript for probably the last time, when I got news about the fire, and I just felt so, I thought, no, he had enough bad luck. That was what came into my head. He already had enough bad luck. But I was just glad, looking back, that the fire came when his reputation was at its all-time high, and therefore people all around the world pledged money and the building is being rebuilt. But it still does seem very sad.
So bizarre, isn't it, that you never knew? So questions. So this is your moment. We've got 15 minutes or so, I think. So, okay.
I'm just interested in the fact that as an outsider and the whole strangeness of this man, from the anecdote that you first heard, has created this whole story, which is, it's all about that fear and that difference of something from outside, and you wonder why. Is that where the whole story sort of came to you? That as an outsider, people are a bit, just a bit concerned about you, a bit worried and all this sort of thing. You are a foreigner, but you trying to be in.
Can you hear at the back?
You want to repeat the question?
Yeah, so it's, you were saying that it all came about because he was an outsider in the way people view outsiders, I think, and that was the initial sort of starting of the book.
Was that my inspiration? Really?
Yes.
I think it was a mixture of feeling that it wasn't my story and therefore sort of tracking that I couldn't write that story, and then finding that once I'd found a way into it through the house that felt mine, I wasn't an outsider to the story anymore. And then I could examine it. But I think him being an outsider is what gave my story its sort of fulcrum, because Thomas is right there at the heart. And then he can watch this man and see how he develops and tell us his story. But what I found, because I wanted to tell Macintosh's story within the book, and I kept going on and thinking, when's he going to start really telling Thomas his story? And it doesn't come until sort of about halfway through that Macintosh feels relaxed enough to start to really open up. And that just had its own momentum. I had to just allow that relationship and that friendship to grow before Macintosh really starts to tell him about his life. And obviously it helps that he's late in the bar drinking with Thomas's father, the sort of oils of the whiskey chaser, and that all helped.
Just leading on from that, question about the process of writing. I was intrigued when you were talking about finding your way into the story. I mean, does that happen with every novel, or are there some which are more difficult to get into than others? Do you have false starts?
Shall I just you at the back. So the question is about how you actually get into the story. Do you have false starts, the whole process of writing?
I'm just trying to think. It's not that I don't remember, it's just, do I ever not have a full start? That I was trying to think, is it ever just, what you always hope is, especially if a book's been really difficult, I always have a bit of a fantasy that this is going to be the easy one. And this is going to be a slim, easy book. It's going to kind of fly out of my fingers. But I did have that, yes, I did have that once. I did have that once with my second book. I started it, and it just pretty much 3 pages a day came out, as is the published book. That was very, very rare and gave me a very dangerous full sense of security. But when I started my third book, which took 4 years, and every word was a torment. But it's not to say that it's a better. You see, I thought at first, when things come really fast, maybe, I worried a lot. Does that mean they're not very good, or does it mean that the things that are struggle aren't very good? I was trying to work out. What I noticed is when I read back through my books, I can't tell, I do remember, but the quality of each page is much the same, whether it took me 6 weeks or half an hour. It doesn't actually matter. That's a strange thing. But sometimes, yes, I've got 3 abandoned manuscripts that just were such full starts that I had to give up on them, including 157 pages of what was going to be a book called The Blue Anchor, told from the point of view of the woman and the ghost, and it turned into this book. And I kept thinking, oh, I'll be able to go back to that, maybe I'll weave it in, maybe there'll be alternate chapters. But no, once you hit on the right thing, the thing that wasn't quite right, you just never want to revisit it. I occasionally will read through in between books and think, maybe I'll surprise my publisher with, and I had one I prepared earlier. There it is. But it's usually abandoned for a very good reason, that it's actually really boring, or there's just no energy in it. There's something that just didn't take off. You just don't know that. The best idea in the world can just not have legs to it.
Does it just have to start to live? Because
Yes.
you talked about it as if they're almost lives of their own. You said that Macintosh and Thomas, it took a while for them to actually get to the conversation, as if it was them deciding it, not you.
Yes, it's a strange thing. So my narrator of the first draft, the Blue Anchor, and I like that title, I hope to use that one day, I could never even quite work out what she was called. And that wasn't a good sign, but that can happen. I just could never quite, I kept changing her name, and she was droning on, as it seemed to me, about this, that, and the other. Never a good feeling. God, I mean, but then, sometimes, as a writer, you get very bored of your material. I once, a friend of mine texted me saying, what are you up to? And I said, falling asleep over a book, unfortunately my own. But actually, that book was okay. That book, I was just bored of it that day. So it's really, really hard. I mean, it's so hard to know. It's a terrible dilemma of a writer, when to give up on something, or when just to have a break, let someone else read it. But anyway, I was feeling that this unnamed narrator was droning on one day when I decided I would give the ghost a voice. This was a real turning point for me. And I knew this ghost well, because for 10 years I'd been sort of saying, I know you're there, and passing him in the back hall, without ever formulating it or mentioning it to my family. They were amazed when I told them, yes, what, you didn't see that ghost? They couldn't believe it when I started talking about the publicity for this book, and I said, yes, there was a ghost. I'd never mentioned it to them. But so I knew this ghost quite well, and I gave him a voice, and he said, my name is Thomas Maggs. I was born upstairs in a small room, not the smallest room with the outshot window where I sleep now, or the main room that is kept for visitors, summer guests, who write and tell my mother that they're, and I thought, oh my God, this is alive. This is actually giving me goosebumps. And I know everything about him. And that was it, really. I never really went back to, shall we get builders in to redesign the kitchen? My other narrator. Thomas was telling me his story.
When you write, do you have a very structured day? Or does it sort of, do you sit down for a bit and then if it sort of starts right, you find something else to do? Or do you sit in front of it until lunchtime and then afternoon? And
I do have a very structured day. I was terrified you were going to say, do I have a very structure? No, but I have a structured day, thank God. I write 5 days a week, and I sit down usually by 10. I'm desperate to get to my desk. There seem to be a lot of things, kids and dogs and things that I have to do. But if it goes past 10, I'm actually starting to fret, and I get into my study and I stay there ideally until 2, and I sometimes run downstairs for a cup of tea. But that's really, really important to me. And if it's not going well, I just rewrite page before, or I start at the beginning and look at it. I don't think if it's not going well, that never really happens, because there's always something to rewrite. I do an awful lot of rewriting to trick myself into moving on a bit. I'm not trying to make word count progress. I'm just trying to live in the story for another day. And so I don't think, oh, this is a rubbish day, I'm not going to do any. No, I'm always involved in it. And if I can do that 5 days a week, things are really happening. If I can do so many things come in, unfortunately, to sort of, there's one day where I can't, or the horror of one of my children going, I don't feel well today.
It's interesting because it's almost the way you sort of describe it. If it's got sort of past 10, you start to sort of get a bit like that. It's almost like it is a part of you, it's another child almost that you have to sort of tend to.
I have to tend to it, you're right. And if I don't, I have a strange energy in the morning. And on Saturday, I actually started teaching a writing class on Saturday morning because I was so much more energy than anyone else in the house. They'd all been out all week and they wanted to do nothing on Saturday morning. I suppose I'd been in all week. And I thought, what about, going to the South Bank and walking along, shut up. So I have a lot of energy in the morning and I have to use it then. And I can't write in the afternoon. If I have to do something in the morning, which, something else that is taking me away from it, and I come back at, say, 2, unless it's editing or an article or something, I promise, I very rarely try and do creative work. I just don't have the same drive or the same good mood. And you're very bad to write in a bad mood because you will think that everything you're writing is rubbish. Good tip for any budding writers.
At what point do you know how you're going to end the book?
It's really nice to know something very near the end that's going to happen as a sort of security blanket. And then I like the idea that the very end is open to what might come about. But I like that I sort of often have a shape in my head of the book. So it's about here, I like to know, and then there's a little tail.
Do you change the end much sometimes? You do something, I don't like it, and I move on.
Yes, actually with this book, without wanting to give away the end, I changed it quite dramatically. And that was exciting. And yes, the end, I think getting the end right in a book is one of the hardest things. And I think some of my books, I've just tailed off. And I wish, the book's never really done, but there's a few of my books I wish I could go back to and just give the end another few beats. And I'm really pleased with the end of this book, actually. I had the idea for the end, and it was inspired by a story that I read, and to do with time. And I wanted to play with time, because I wanted to try and tell Macintosh's whole life within a year. So I thought about that quite a lot, and thought about different ways that were quite unrealistic in a way, or unnaturalistic, to try and actually encompass someone's whole life within a year. So that was quite exciting and challenging. But when I was less ambitious, I sort of someone once said it was like someone just came into your study and shot you in the back of the head. And then I added a discarded chapter to that. Put it back on.
Do you think, I was going to ask you about the end as well, because someone else who's read the book with me, we don't see the end the same. Is that how you feel it should be?
No, I was surprised.
Probably wrong.
Well, no one's really wrong, but people, particularly from book clubs, have got in touch and asked me some questions that I didn't really know the answer and I didn't expect. So I think that the end is open to interpretation a lot more than I intended. In fact, for the paperback, I put a few little changes in to make it a little bit clearer, because actually you can't tell sometimes. I don't think it was as clear as I intended.
It's very difficult without talking about it. It did bring tears to my eyes anyway.
Good. So I don't mean to make you sound, but as long as you're moved, it doesn't really matter.
So I shall look at the paperback. Sorry, anyone else? We've still got 5 more minutes. I've got one.
There's someone here?
Yeah, someone here behind the...
Digressing from the literary theme, where do his furniture designs fit into the picture? And did he not make any money from his furniture?
Well, what was interesting about Macintosh was he was so versatile. So he did these designs for buildings, but painted and made incredibly beautiful furniture. And the furniture that he made was often for the houses that he designed. So he designed 2 private houses just on the outskirts of Glasgow, and the furniture in them. And he designed the most beautiful, beautiful home that he designed with his wife. And he made, it's part of the Hunterian Museum now. So when you go into the museum, you can go and look around the house, the 3-story house that he and Margaret created out of a very traditional terraced house. They lowered the ceilings, they did things to the windows, and it's full of the most beautiful furniture and beautiful art that she created. She was an expert in this art form called gesso, which is very hard to achieve. You make the plaster of Paris and you weave in coloured glass and string, which made these incredibly beautiful designs, and they hang in this house. And the furniture, there's a white double bed. It's so romantic and enticing, and a mirror, a white stand-up mirror. It looks like its arms are coming out to kind of draw you in. And the huge, famous Macintosh chairs at either end of a long table. He must have made some money. At the high point of his career was around 1900, and he must have made some money then because they bought this house and they were doing pretty well. But you know, money doesn't last. When things started to go wrong, you know, I suppose that money just trickled away, and people didn't really want him to keep designing these things. And some of the furniture is in the Glasgow School of Art. Some of the furniture's there. People buy small pieces. I was in Australia actually doing a literary festival, and in the Adelaide Museum they had 2 of his chairs that they had bought.
So they would just be part of the fee for doing the house and furniture, I suppose, all in one
suppose
package.
they might have been one package, or the money disappeared, or he just had to live on that for so many years.
Did he construct them? Did he build them?
Physically,
Yes.
he was very able to, but I think as time went on, he got craftsmen to do that. I think when he was a student and when he was first, he constructed things. But I think that certainly for the Glasgow School of Art, he apparently had a huge amount of charm and charmed all sorts of craftsmen, particularly creating all sorts of little extra pieces of stained glass and little tiny playful details in plaster that were, if you look at the building closely, outside there were all these little Glasgow roses and birds hidden among the pillars, and there's so many details over and above anything that was ever needed. And apparently there was a letter that he was sent saying from the people putting up the money, please keep the budget forever before you. Which made me laugh. There's a lot of panic about the detail.
Very quickly, because I know that there was a lady there who was going to ask a question. Do you want to just do your question and then that time frame?
I was going to ask you about your treatments of and descriptions of childhood, because to me they're really strong, they're really kind of submerging. So I just wondered how you did that, why you did that. I'm thinking of The Wilds and It Is Kinky, where, you know, just so strong.
This is about the descriptions of childhood.
I think as a writer, ideally, some things come easily to you because it's so difficult, and some things are difficult, so it challenges you. And writing from the points of children seems to come easily because, you know, with this book, it was meant to be a 35-year-old woman telling the story. Didn't seem to have a connection with her in the way that I did when Thomas, aged 13, started telling the story. Just don't know why. I felt very caught up in my own childhood, and even when I was living it, I felt sort of aware of it being a story. And because it was full of stories, and maybe in a way of making sense of it, and the chaos of so many elements of it, that I sort of made it into stories, and therefore kind of was the little heroine of this story, or watched other people in their dramatic situations. I just don't know, but as soon as I started writing my first book, and it was from the point of view of a child of 5, I never even noticed that was the case. I just thought, this is the way to tell this story. And it was only when people started to read it, and they were saying, it's very unusual to be able to tell a whole story from the point of view of a 5-year-old child and still make it accessible. And I thought, oh, how strange, yes, it never even occurred to me that that's what I've done. And I don't really think of my narrators as being children, they just happen to be that person telling the story. They might be 10, or 5, or 13, but they're just the person telling the story.